Good morning, YouTube. Warble's on a lot here. Thought it might be more or less time for a Corona update, perhaps. Here in Oz, where for a while there we were doing nearly as good as Jacinta Ardern's Kiwis across the Tasman. They've pretty much eliminated SARS Corona 2. And we were doing pretty well, but we had some problems. Sydney let the Ruby Princess in. Then we had a lot of people coming back from overseas who were supposed to go into self-isolation who didn't. Then in Melbourne, they had some issues with their quarantine. They were quarantining people in vertical Petri dish type hotels. And instead of having police or trained security guards or experienced people, maybe even getting nursing staff in charge of the security guards to perhaps set a few protocols. The lowest bid tenderer got the health department contract, and then they subcontracted somebody who was prepared to use unqualified, untrained, inexperienced people who were on the job seeker payment. Therefore, they would work for below minimum wages, cash in hand. They were advised not to get tested if they developed a headache or a sniffle or a sore throat or a cough, because if they got tested positive, that would make it difficult to maintain the rosters because it was such a small outfit that was subcontracting. And then when they did get tested as positive and they were told to self-isolate, they were so far down the economic food chain, they went working as Uber drivers. So Melbourne's got a bit of a community transmission issue. And 3 weeks ago, when they sort of jumped from maybe 2 to 4 new cases a day up to 9 new cases a day, instead of locking down, the politicians listened to the busyness lobby who kept minimising it and saying, oh, it's only a few cases. Yeah, we're going to deal with each outbreak as it comes. The Business-As-Usual Lobby and the Chamber of Commerce have one thing in common. Not one of them ever elected to study biology in high school when they got to doing year 11 and year 12. They literally do not understand how life on Earth works. They think the planet is one big cash register. So the vague parameters of this SARS-CoV-2 is that it's highly infectious. It's not merely droplet infectious, snot droplets from a sneeze. It is aerosol, airborne infectious. So the individual molecules of water coming out of your lungs, the ones that'll float 8 meters away and hang in the air for hours, they might have a virus attached to the outside of the well, it'll actually be 2 water molecules of water vapor coming out of your lungs. 20 to 40% of the people who are infected remain asymptomatic for the whole period of their infection. They don't ever feel sick, but they are contagious for at least 3 weeks. People who do develop the symptoms at the 5-day to the 18-day mark, with 28 days being the recognised outlier. So you might as well say that if somebody comes up with being sick today, they were exposed on average to the virus 11 days ago. Let's be safe if we want to catch it and say 18 days ago, that's when they became infected. Once they become infected, if they become sick enough to go into hospital, and the average age of the people going into hospital is 54. Once they go present with some form of an illness and they get tested, well, then you're looking at 97% of the dead had some pre-existing illness. 90% of the dead are 60 years old or over. If you're clinically obese, that halves your chances of recovering. There are 2 dead men for every dead woman. A person's most infectious period in time is 15 hours before they get their first symptoms, if they get any symptoms. They may have been infectious, for as long as 5 days before they get their first indication that they are ill. So anybody who is putting their faith in the idea of asking people who feel sick not to go to work, not to go shopping, it doesn't matter. Those people who feel sick have been merrily wandering around infecting other people for 15 hours to 5 days before they get their first headache or cough. That's the bit that the busyness lobby has failed to comprehend. They've said, oh, okay, we've had a lockdown. It was terrible. It was horrible. It hurt me business. Now we've got down to very low levels. We can go back to business, and we got to pressure everybody to open back up and have 300 people go to the pub. We want to have football teams moving around and playing each other, even if we're not allowed watch in person. We want to be able to watch the actual football teams playing. But football players have no better nursing education on average than do bottom feeder, casual, unskilled security guards. The security guards in Melbourne that I mentioned earlier, they were doing a few dopey things. They were allowing the people they were supposed to be quarantining in their rooms to move around the corridors, up and down the lifts to visit family members in other rooms. The security guards were going with them to escort them, and none of them were wearing masks or gloves. The security guards were escorting the people they were supposed to be quarantining in isolation in their hotel rooms in the vertical Petri dishes. They were escorting them out to go and get takeaway. They were copulating with the people that they were supposed to be quarantining in the rooms. And then they were going home and they were shagging their missus, infecting people where they lived. And because they were bottom feeders, a bunch of them were living all in one great big vertical Petri dish of a tower. So yeah, there's 30 or 50 cases over there. And they move in the sort of circles where all of their partners have jobs, quite often as assistants in nursing, perhaps nurses' aides, at aged care homes. And because the aged care home proprietors like to massively understaff, they rely on nursing agencies or people who have applied to be put on the casual call-in list, and nobody can actually get enough casual work at any one nursing home to make a living. So they have their name on the list for 3 or 5 or 7 surrounding, in the city there's lots of them, aged care homes or private hospitals. And they rely on the idea that they might get enough shifts among 3 or 5 different hospitals that it'll add up to having an actual job at one of them. And that's the level of financial insecurity that they live their lives at. So yesterday I heard the union representative from the Nursing and Allied Health Union on radio complaining about the idea that the private nursing homes and the private hospitals and the public hospitals were starting to complain about people working at multiple sites. They've got 50 different clusters at 50 different old people's homes and hospitals in Victoria because this has been going on. And finally, at the end of the interview, the Nursing Allied Health Union rep said, we don't mind the idea that they want people to only work for one hospital or old people's home, but that old people's home should undertake to give them a full job so that they can actually afford to live. Because if every hospital had its own casual call-in list who were paid a retainer for being on the list, as well as just a slightly higher hourly rate, and that slightly higher hourly rate gets scooped up by the nursing agency, which maintains the rosters and has the call-in staff to assign people from, you're not going to do the washing up tonight, dearie, you're going to go over there and pull a night shift. But that's how we've managed to spread it around in Victoria and get to the point where last week they were having 200 or 300 new cases every day. And of course, the tourist lobby, the entertainment lobby, they'd been pushing to have state borders reopened, which they succeeded in doing 3 weeks ago, just as Melbourne was cooking up and brewing and stewing and sending out all of its asymptomatic infectious people from the quarantine guard fiasco. So in Sydney, there's a thing called the Crossroads Hotel at Casula, and they know they've got in excess of 30 cases there. And part of their problem is they weren't complying with the regulation that says hotels have to keep a record of names and addresses of all of their patrons. The other thing is that because it's a Crossroads hotel that gets lots and lots of travellers, it's a really big busyness. Truck drivers go there. And truck drivers have been complaining since the Victorian borders got closed a couple of days ago. Oh, boo-hoo, these people are saying that when we do a run from Sydney to Melbourne, we're supposed to go into quarantine for 14 days. How can we keep our business going if we're going into quarantine? There's all of these self-centered, self-obsessed individuals who seem to prioritise their own wants and needs against the reality of epidemiology and virology and public health and community health. You either have a lockdown and everybody shelters in place until the virus is burnt out, or you accept the fact that the virus is going to continue to spread throughout the community and the number of new cases will double every 3 days. And if you have a look at how many people have had the disease globally to date, how many people out of all that have had it have died to date, you get a case fatality rate of around 4%. But as I explained earlier, it takes time to die or to recover, about 3 weeks. So to get an actual case fatality rate, instead of dividing the number of deaths today into the number of known cases today, you got to divide today's death rate into the number of known cases 3 weeks ago. And when you do that, we've got a case fatality rate of somewhere around 12%. It's culling the already sick. It's culling 2 men for every woman. It's culling the old, and it's culling the fat. And it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, there's an awful lot of people who are fat. In America, 76% of the population is fat. In Australia, it's 60, maybe 63%. There's a lot of fat people out there. You have a look at any of these video clips of people being thermometer checked as they go to Disney World because, it's a magical universe where magical thinking reigns supreme. There's not many skinny people there. Have a look at any movie footage or still photography taken 50, 60, 70 years ago. There's not many fat people in the frame. from memory, I think all that started to really seriously change in Australia in about 1975, 76, when Kentucky Fried Chicken started to advertise on the television. So, old fat sick pricks are going to die out at twice the rate of the old fat sick cunts, technically speaking. And as a 59-year-old man, can I argue with that? My generation, my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation. People who for 30 to 60 years have consistently voted in favour of cheap electricity, lots of jobs, paying high wages, let's grow the economy. And we want cheap petrol as well as cheap electricity. The people who have voted to go full steam ahead with anthropogenic global warming, clear felling, habitat destruction, over-harvesting, irrigation, salination, desertification, whatever it takes, plasticization of the ocean with pollution, to grow the sacred economy so that they could have a convenient, rich, fat, happy, shiny, mass-produced, mass-consumed life. Sure, not everybody thought like that, but, you know, I've always been outnumbered. I've always been outvoted. I've still had a pretty nice life. I figure if the Wuhan horseshoe bat virus gets here, the bat eater's lament virus, if I'm one of the people who gets killed in the shotgun effect, well, yeah, golly gosh. That means next time that Greta Thunberg addresses the United Nations, her audience is going to be a whole lot younger, much more inclined to accept the science rather than the traditional ideology and the temptation to follow where greed leads. Strikes me that all of the people who are in serious positions of financial power, the people who own the title deeds, the people who own the shares of the corporations who own the title deeds, the people who collect the rent and the lease fees, the people who collect the interest on all the loans and the mortgages, the people who collect the profits from the insurance premiums. They're all pretty old. These are the people who had been planning to live fat, rich, happy lives for another 30 odd years. The ones my age want to live till they're 85 or 90 or so and then magically drop off the perch. And it's all expected to be financed by the profits of the global vile age's international trading economy. And they figure that their grandchildren will happily work 3 casual jobs at minimum wages in order to pay their rent and their internet fees and keep themselves in hamburgers. So that the multinationals, the corporations in which the old farts have got their superannuation funds sunk into in the form of shares, so those multinational corporations will continue to turn a fat profit to pay the old farts to retire in the lap of luxury. That entire game plan appears to be knocked out the window by the bat eater's lament virus. The airline industry, I can't see it's ever going to get back to where it used to be pre-COVID-19. Part 1, you can't park an aeroplane on the ground for 6 months and then get in it and fly it again. Part 2, the pilots are supposed to fly a certain number of actual hours in the air, not in a simulator, in order to maintain their license currency. So airline pilots all over the world are becoming unskilled street sweepers, just as the clock goes around. Oops, that way for you on the camera. The tourist industry, the idea of a stranger being a walking cash cow who's made their pile somewhere else doing something else, and they've travelled the world to come here so we can fleece them while they gawp at us for being so cute and quaint and picturesque. That whole business plan, it's disappearing with the airlines because nobody anywhere in the world is making any money. They certainly haven't got enough of it to go on a clap catching expedition to Bali every year. Doesn't matter whether they're telephone sanitisers or hairdressers' apprentices. Not going to happen. Here in Australia, as part of its emergency measures when they first brought in the social isolation lockdown, in recognition of the fact that a whole bunch of people who did not deserve to be treated like shit were suddenly going to find themselves unemployed, our government modified the unemployment or the New Start allowance, which used to be about half the pension, whether it's disability or old age pension, or doesn't matter. I guess military pensions are higher than old age or disability. But anyway, call the old age or the disability pension your benchmark. Being unemployed paid about half that. 20 years ago, the unemployment benefit was 3/4 of the pension, and you could almost, if you were very, very tight-fisted, you could live on the dole. Now you pretty much can't. If you're on the dole for any length of time, you're going to have a cash-in-hand job to supplement your income. Back to life. To recognise the fact that COVID was going to make a whole bunch of people who used to have jobs suddenly unemployed, and the government didn't want to persecute them in the way they'd been persecuting the actually unemployed, they boosted the unemployment rate to actually slightly more than the pension. $1,050 a fortnight rather than $987 a fortnight. But effectively, being on the dole has been boosted to the equivalent to the pension. People who their boss thought they might be able to find a job for them after the lockdown, they're on what they call a job keeper program, where their boss gets paid $1,500 a week to pay them as a keeper fee. So they're not going to work, they're staying at home, they're getting paid $1,500 a week, so they're still getting better than the new unemployment, which is the same as the pension. It strikes me that governments of the world are going to be in a situation where they have a choice between printing money and issuing everybody who hasn't got a job with enough money to cover their actual life costs and live frugally, or watch while civilization unravels in an orgy of hunger-driven violence and robbery and looting and brigandage and all that sort of shit that goes on when everything totally unravels. Because instead of actually staying locked down, what we've done is we've reopened too early. We have accommodated the desires of the Busyness-As-Usual Lobby and the Chamber of Commerce. And as I said, none of them ever studied biology. They didn't study it. They don't understand growth rates in bacteria and viruses when they've got no constraints on them. They don't get the idea that if you've only got 4 cases per day for a couple of weeks and now you've got 9 cases per day, that means that in 3 days' time you're going to have 18, and 3 days after that you're going to have 36, and 3 days after that you're going to have 100, and 3 days after that you're going to have 300 new cases a day. And that's exactly precisely what happened in Victoria. And because, what's her name, Palaszczuk, the New South Wales Premier, she doesn't want to have to accept the medical advice. Oh, we've come out of the crisis and now we're reopening. Oh, I don't want to close down in response to these outbreaks. You can't keep backing off and going forward and backing off and going forward. All of the people who told her that you have to reopen the economy as soon as possible, not one of them understood that the implications are, if you reopen as soon as possible, then at the very earliest sign that things are going wrong, you have to lock down as hard or harder. So she thought she was bringing in an era of we're going to recover and we're going to have a J-shaped curve and we're going to get back to normal and snap back, as Morrison said. No. Now, what she locked us into is a release restrictions a bit, poke your head up. Oh, lots of viruses out there, pull your head back in, release, pull back, release. She's committed us to at least another 3 to 6 months of worrying about it. We need to have a 3-month lockdown, right? Because from the day you get infected to the day you show you got the virus, that's 2 weeks. From the day you show you got the virus to the day you've recovered or you died, that's another 3 weeks. So you got 5 weeks is the actual, worst case, how long can it take course of this? And that still leaves a minuscule little outlier of 1 or 2% who are going to be around for even longer. So to get rid of this virus without a vaccine, without any particularly effective treatment, you have to quarantine the population until 2 incubation periods after the last person who had the disease dies or recovers. Okay, that's straight out of barrier nursing lectures from 1980. Everything that's happening now is exactly what we were warned to be afraid of in 1981 in virology and epidemiology lectures at Concord Repat Hospital, where they said to us that ever since the Sunderland flying boats and the Constellation airliners were replaced by Boeing 707s, the price of airline tickets has been getting lower and lower and lower. And the number of people travelling from country to country to country to country all around the world and the number of interconnecting flights and possibilities mean that if or when a pneumonia virus comes out of an overcrowded animal population beside an overcrowded human population, when you get a zoonotic species jump, if it gets into the people and it kills everybody straight away, that's not much of a problem because that'll be easy to identify and it might even kill itself off before it gets 50 miles. That was in 1980. I think Marburg virus had first occurred in 1976 or something, 74. It was cited as an example. You notice that sort of shit really early. They said what you have to be afraid of is something that's really contagious, that has a long asymptomatic incubation period during which time people are contagious, and it only kills 5 or 10 or maybe even 15, 20% of the people who get infected. Because they said that will take 2 or 3 months for the medical community in any nation on earth to actually recognize and notice that it's happening. You're going to have to wait until you've got so many cases that the hospitals get swamped, the intensive cares get overloaded, and that's when somebody says, wow, all of these people are in here with viral pneumonia and it's all behaving the same, and where do they come from? Yeah, that's about the situation that the Chinamen were in about November, December, I think. It had been working its way through their community for a while before the first doctor twigged to what was going on. And they said to us in 1981, by that time, it will have been everywhere, all over the world. The airlines will carry it everywhere. Which is why in late January, early February, when I was talking to my son and the mega fires were still on and we were still in the drought and we'd had a bit of rain here, but there were still fires breaking out all over the bloody place. I said to him, well, there's a viral pneumonia pandemic coming out of China. He said, yeah, and I said, look along the western horizon. We've got the 2 biggest Chinese wind farms in Australia, 20 miles out of town. Between them 2 wind farms, there's got to be half a dozen people who either go from the wind farm on a pilgrimage to the factory in China, or they come from the factory in China out here to fix something. They're not going to tell the Australians how it works enough to fix it because trade secrets, So we've got a constant backwards and forwards flow from the wind farms in Australia to China. If this thing's really contagious, it'll be here by the end of February. As I said in my very first video about the coronavirus, which I think was about the 10th of February, a lot of people who were working in Glen Innes back around Christmas, New Year, had a particularly nasty dose of the flu, which hung around for a while and surprised them with how unpleasant it was. If the bat eaters virus is as fast as all that, it might have already been through here. I've noticed, since about December, there's been a thicker hanging on the Who's Dead Now wall outside the community centre. Every time you go to town, instead of there being one person up there, there's generally two or three. So, yeah, saw 5 hanging there one day. Yet, officially here in this part of the countryside, we haven't had any corona deaths. Just a lot of old people dropping dead after getting pneumonia. So who knows? Who knows? It seems to me that Anastasia Palaszczuk, our Premier, she's done everything to ensure that we're going to have a major outbreak in New South Wales. Campbelltown and Camden have now been put on Queensland's list of you can't come here, and I think that's something that they're local government areas. So there's something like 97 discrete suburbs in that area. They're now declared a no-go zone for Queensland. It's like the people who are in the business-as-usual lobby in the Chamber of Commerce, all they can see is their profit forecasts, and all they care about is how far behind they are with their loans and their loan repayments. None of them seem to understand that we're in this situation because humanity has pushed the environment too hard, too far, for too long. I mean, once upon a time, no civilization or culture had ever crashed the local ecology across a bigger area than maybe 500 miles radius. The first time that happened was at Göbekli Tepe, about 11,000, couple of hundred years ago. You know, they started 12,300 years ago. 30 years after they commenced feeding stonemasons with wild harvested food from 200 or 500 miles away in every direction. After 30 years, the first hybrid seed was in their midden. 300 years later, all the grain in the midden was hybrid strains. That's where the broadacre agro cult of harvest everythingism began. 400 years after that, city abandoned, surrounded by desert. The harvest everythingists had created their first desert. Refugees in the diaspora spread out. They took the agro cult everywhere they went. 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, people in Europe had progressed to the point where they had thousands of them living in little settlements, 1,000 at a time. They had wheels on carts pulled by oxes. They grew crops. They kept animals. They didn't do sewage. They drank out of the streams. Their population sort of fluctuated. Titrated by disease, I guess. And then out of the southern end of the Caucasus Mountains, there came the Yamnayans. Big, tall, strong, warlike horse milk drinkers. And it took them about 1,000 years to get from the Spanish Atlantic coast to Norway, top of Scotland, bottom of India, all the way across to the Siberian sea coast and the Chinese Pacific coast. The advance of the Yamnayans was apparently so fast that 100 years After the British built Stonehenge, there was no British Y chromosomes in existence anywhere on any of the British Isles because the Yamnayans had come along, killed all the men and boys, kept the women and the girls as wives or slaves, adopted local customs as taught to them by their new wives as appropriate for the climate and the conditions. I don't think they got south of the Sahara, but if you look at a satellite picture of the Earth with the clouds removed, you can see how it all started. That bare Earth that's spread upwind across Africa, across the northern side of the Mediterranean, downwind. That's where it started. The baring of the Earth, turning food forest into desert. The broadacre agro-cult of harvest everythingism. And the cruel irony is that was about the same time, like when the first hybrid seed was being dropped in the midden. That was when the Australian Aborigines were recovering from the sinking of the land bridge to Papua New Guinea, looking at the striped pipefish on the beach, painting the striped pipefish onto the walls to symbolise the coming of a whole new way of life, religiously dedicated to maintaining the environment at its most sustainable, so that everybody tries to put more into the environment than they take out, so that next year there's a bigger harvest for everyone. Which is how come 250 years ago, when British Yamnayans showed up here and Captain Cook shot the first Aborigine that he ever met, the first British looked at Australia and they said, "Ah, the biggest estate on earth," which is why Bill Gammage quoted that as the title for his book. Look it up, Biggest Estate on Earth, Bill Gammage. Get a copy, read it. And as somebody else wrote in a book called Guns, Steel and Germs, maybe I got the order of that wrong, but influenza, smallpox, that was one of the ways the Europeans sort of pre-sterilised Australia before the sheep got there. It's ironic that horseshoe bats in China have released a virus that seems to be ticking every box that we were told to worry about back in 1981. It's spread all around the world. It's infectious. It's contagious, highly contagious, airborne droplet contagious. But it only kills 10 or 15%. And it's killing the old. It's killing the people who made the decisions to expand the economy to the point where some entrepreneur in China decided that a clever thing to do would be to go out and catch a whole lot of wild bats and bring them back to town and keep them tightly enclosed, stressed out in a cage. And then when somebody come along and wanted to buy a dozen bats to take home and make bat soup, he's pulled the head off the bats. He's singed them over a candle to get rid of the hair. And then he's opened their belly up and cut their insides out, lungs, heart, liver, intestines, all that, pulled it out. And rather than waste it, he's thrown the bat guts to the pangolins. And he's taken a bat virus and put it into the pangolins. And most of the viruses have died, but some of them have survived in the pangolins. And surprise, surprise, the variety that survives in the pangolin, it survives in the people. Yay, Team Gaia hypothesis. I can't say I can argue with any of it on the grounds of fairness, particularly the quirk that instead of just killing all humans, it specifically targets us old farts, the ones who voted to do this to the planet. So, that's what appears to be going on. I think it's delightfully ironic that in the excited status of Norte Armed Americano, Trumpy has done everything he could for as long as he could to get his own supporter base. You know, those old, fat, sick, retired Americans who buy what Trump is selling. He's encouraged them to not wear masks and to gather in public places. There are people who are claiming that protesters, whether it's Black Lives Matter protesters or statue pulling downers, they're supposed to be the ones that the ultra right wing, we don't want to wear mask mob want to blame for the resurgence in COVID after the first lockdown. Trouble is, all the studies that have been done have showed that the COVID transmission rates actually dropped during the period of the most exuberant, violent, howling protests in the US, because most of the population stayed at home because they didn't want to go out and get involved in being tear gassed or beaten up or whatever was going on. The people who went out were the people who are actually a bit switched on. So they knew they were taking a risk. They accepted the fact they were taking the risk, but they wore masks and they practiced as much social distancing as they could. That didn't last long when they started getting beaten by the police. But here's the thing. Your average police's riot uniform is not designed to protect the policeman from a virus. So they went out and tear gassed people and made them fill the air with aerosol. Any of them who happened to be virus infected got it everywhere. It got all over the police uniforms. And then after they'd done their shift tear gassing protesters, they went back to the cop shops and patted each other on the back and gave each other hugs for how brave they'd been and how patriotic they were and how they showed them. And then they went home and gave the virus to their families. So, yeah, there was a bit of a spike, but it was the Memorial Day celebrations when the Americans said, okay, that's it. We've been locked down for a while. Now let's go out and all go swimming, all in the same swimming pool. Here in Australia, all of the people who went to those protests, they were warned ahead of time, this is a really bad idea community health-wise. Please don't go. If you are going to go, wear a mask. If you are going to go, socially distance. If you are going to go, we ask that you self-isolate for 14 days afterwards, and we ask that you present yourself for testing. And okay, the testing people were swamped by protesters who went to the protest, wore a mask, stayed apart. One of them tested positive, and they got it from their partner who worked at a meatworks. Or maybe it was one of the quarantine guard breakdowny things. But yeah, there was one protester who turned up for testing, and they didn't get COVID at the protest. They took COVID to the protest, but they were wearing a mask. And the people who'd been around them at the protest, they were all tested and they come back with negative tests. So there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation going out there. I really don't understand how the US can put up with having their president contradicting all of the known nursing and medical science accumulated over the past 3,000 years on how to deal with a plague or a pandemic. Social isolation, quarantine, this is all really, really rock solid, well known, well documented. There's no need to prove any of this. Hoping for a vaccine, yeah, wouldn't it be nice if? It's not quite pie in the sky when we die, said the crow. Quote from George Orwell's Animal Farm there. But you know, it's a coronavirus. If you get any immunity from having it next year, you won't have that immunity. So you're going to have to come up with a virus and make shit potloads of it and vaccinate everybody. And the fact is that the economy is coming unraveled. If the politicians had held the medical line 3-4 weeks ago and said to the footballers and the publicans and the restaurateurs and the tourism busyness operators, if the politicians had just said, no, medical community says no, not yet. You wait until we're like New Zealand and we haven't had any new cases, or Western Australia, they had no cases over there for 8 weeks or something. They did really well in Western Australia. But, they've had people crossing the Nullarbor backwards and forwards for the past couple of weeks, and now they're locking down again, saying, oh, no, we won't have the Victorians. But the Victorians have been everywhere. So I guess I might have to do a video on barrier nursing, reverse barrier nursing, mask and glove discipline. Because masks, they can be ambiguous. That's why there's been a reluctance among the political community to advocate people wear masks, because if you do masks wrong, they actually can make shit a lot worse in terms of facilitating infectious transfer. If you do masks right, yeah, masks are good. Because we're dealing with a virus, your N95 mask is probably going to exclude 80% of all the viruses, because they'll be stuck onto a big enough water molecule that it won't be able to get through the mask. But anyway, that's for another video. What I'm saying is that all of the people who chose to be optimistic regarding the option of opening the economy early, because, it'll be fine, we'll get on top of this, and none of them actually knew what they were talking about. All of them were wishful thinking, ventilating, whistling in the dark to make themselves feel brave. All I can say is it's amazing what a slow motion, gentle process it's turning out to be. And eventually, I guess, the meek will inherit the earth. Because survival of the fittest is a thing. It's just that the fittest doesn't mean the biggest, the nastiest, the greediest, the most selfish, the most rapacious, the most murderous, the most domineering. The fittest is actually the most cooperative, the friendliest, the easiest to get along with, the most reasonable. That's what the fittest is. The way to look at this is, in my view, the Gaia hypothesis, or the creator God theory of the entire universe, is epigenetically, culturally fine-tuning humanity. All of the people who didn't want to believe in science, as they use their mobile phone and their computer and their digital watch, yeah, they're being culled. Not because they don't want to be nice people, but because they refuse to be realists. They refuse to adapt their behaviour in light of reality. They want to grow their economy and make more money because that's what they've always done. It's what their ancestors have always done. They're not interested in changing direction. We could have chosen to change away from endlessly growing the economy back in the 1958 or 59, when Eisenhower was first given a report explaining that global warming was the biggest threat facing human industrial civilization. That's when he set up the National Atmospheric and Oceanographic Organization, NOAA. We have consistently gone along with the forces of unreason, with the people who didn't care how much damage. Back. How much damage their mercenary money-grubbing plans for self-enrichment were going to cause to everything else alive on Earth. Depending on your sources, we're sitting on 408 to 415 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The normal range is 180 to 280. 180 to 280. It was 330 when I was born. It's now 408, 415. Yeah, I can see why the bats in Wuhan have decided to take stern measures to reduce the numbers of the human herd and change the nature of our leadership. All the people who think in the old-fashioned way, the people who think that you've just got to keep competing in the rat race of the human lemmings to see who can jump over the cliff of extinction first, yep, they're getting culled. By their own behaviour, they're getting culled. And the behaviour of their community, they're getting culled. Because they don't want to think differently. It's not something that any one of us can do anything in particular about, except to live our life in a way that makes sense to us. And if it works, we'll be seen to have been doing the right thing, and other people can, if they want to, copy our ways which work. You know, like in my case, yeah, okay, I think feeding the kangaroos is more fun than shooting them. My life works pretty well. If you want to copy that, feed your kangaroos. Develop a personal relationship with a local wildlife. It's more satisfying than being able to walk around knowing that you won't see anything moving because everything hides when they sense your presence. Anyway, that's the rant. Haven't made a video for nearly a week because there's been so much shit going on that it's difficult to keep up with it, and by the time you formulate an opinion on what's going on, it's all got worse again. The Busyness-As-Usual Lobby in the Chamber of Commerce have gained control of the reins of power through the politicians' nose pegs, and they're leading us onward and downward into the gurgly hole of global viral uncontained pandemic. And we'll see what's left of the economy afterwards, because they're not going to do anything consistently to exterminate the virus, so therefore it is going to go through us like a fucking piece of pork through a duck. And if you don't get that reference, go and read My Wicked, Wicked Ways by Errol Flynn. Therein that you will learn how to keep a dozen ducks all on the one string, going in the mouth of the first and out through its arse and in the mouth of the next. Pork goes through a duck really quick, so says Errol Flynn. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Such is life. Have a good one. Stay safe. Ciao.